One of the interesting things about white historiography, this Eurocentric historiography, it hones in always on the things that separate us. They separate us from ourselves. They separate us from our ancestors, from our history, from our families. They divide us up into little fragments. And they never tell you about the unities in struggle that took place in history. And so my historiography hones in just on this point, because the logic of the situation is that if people were oppressed, like the Native Americans were and the African ancestors were, obviously they resisted the oppression. And obviously, as intelligent human beings, it occurred to them that by uniting against a common foe, they would have greater strength in the struggle. But the histories lie there waiting generation after generation. And then I pick up the books by Boyd Thatcher, who is a great admirer of Columbus. But in those books I find that in 1502, there is a rebellion, a major rebellion, in which blacks and Native Americans joined forces. 1492 to 1502. That's 10 years. And in that time begins a struggle. And you're going to find this uniting of the oppressed threading its way through the entire history for 5 centuries. And one of the great epics of the struggle took place in, of all places, in Florida. You know, we have black studies departments all over the country, and do you know, I have seen not one single piece about this to train our children, because the way you defeat someone, you defeat them in the mind first. That's why Garvey said, first you must change your way of thinking, and then peacefully carve up the weapons with which to fight. So they assault the mind. They tell you about rebellions that Nat Turner and Denmark Vesey and Posner. But if you notice, all of them were betrayed. They didn't win. And the one great insurgency that blacks fought in this country for over 130 years is one of the best kept secrets in black history. And it took place in Florida, and you read about it as the Seminole Wars. You've heard about that, haven't you? Seminole Wars? Do you know that there's no such thing as a Seminole? Seminole doesn't exist. Seminole was a Creek word for runways. And those slaves who escaped from the Carolinas and from Virginia down through what eventually became Georgia. Georgia became a state to block the movement of escaped slaves into Florida. Did you know that? That's how they set it up, as, in quotes, a free state. And there in Florida, the blacks were called Seminoles first. The black escapees who went into Florida, who were welcomed by the Native Americans there. And there you had some of the most interesting Native Americans in the entire hemisphere. There was a group called the Calusas, and the Tequestas, and the Apalaches, and even their enemies write about them with respect, because they were some really bad Native Americans. I mean, they... When Ponce de Leon came, and you know we have at the Exploratorium a film on Cabeza de Vaca, who went with the Narvaez expedition. And interesting to see how they're going to do this film. How I learned about the resistance there in Florida is that you have to read a book by a half Native American who was related to the Inca kings. His name was Poma de Ayala. And he had oral testimony from soldiers who had actually fought in Florida. And when Ponce de Leon arrived there, he arrived like a conquistador. And I must tell you quickly how he arrived. It was the Taino pilots who showed him how to navigate those treacherous waters of the Bahamas. Bahama comes from Spanish Bahamar, the shallow sea. Then you anglicize it as Bahamas. So in there you can wreck your ships every second. And the Taino pilots, who were brilliant at navigation and at astronomy and at the science of looking at the motion of waves and judging the distances from land, which, only recently the Smithsonian had some white scholar discover that those black folks in the Pacific were navigating the entire Pacific Ocean in their catamaran boats. And they could look at the motion of the waves and the wind and tell the distances from land in that big, vast Pacific. So this is what the Tainos taught to Ponce de Leon, and he got past that Bahama current and he got to Florida. He immediately fell on the Native Americans and began slaughtering them after they welcomed him. These murderous Spanish and genocidal Spaniards. And what the Calusas did, they waited for him to come back. And then they feted, wined, and dined them for 4 days. And then they fell upon them and killed every single one. They left 6 alive, but barely alive. They wounded them so that the wound would work in enough time when they got back to Cuba to spread the word. Don't come back here. There's some serious folk here. And of course they never learned, so they came back again. Ponce de Leon, we told, he went to look for the fountain of youth. They ended his search 6 days after he arrived in Cuba. He died from the wounds that the Calusas had put upon him. What that did for the Calusas, they learned instantly the logistics of making special arrows that could neutralize the power of horses. They made special bows and arrows with special trajectories and force, and they would put their archers in the trees, and they could shoot an arrow right through the body of a horse. So when you read about how the Indians, the Indians in quote, were terrified of horses, the Calusas dealt with the horses. And then with armor, after killing the Ponce de Leon fellows in armor, they took the armor, they stuffed it with straw, they hung it up on a tree, and they found every weak spot through which their spears and arrows could go. So when the Spaniards came back, they were ready for them. Yeah. They could take care of the armor, they could take care of the horses, and they were more brilliant tacticians in their own land. They could lure. So Alion goes next. And again, he went to a different part of the northern Florida coast. And when he was there, these Appalachians welcomed him, gave them food and drink. And then Allian invited about 300 of the Native Americans on the ships. And when they came aboard, they simply battened down the hatches and started taking them away as slaves. And every single one of them committed suicide before they got to Cuba, rather than face enslavement and this terrible act of treachery. And then Allian made the mistake of going back again. And this time they were ready for him. Once again they feted, wine and dined. And they said to him, Allian, why are you fighting for this distant monarch across the sea? We are warriors, and we would have more respect for you if you came looking out for yourself and your people here. We could share some things with you and show you some techniques of surviving here. Anyway, when the Calusas were finished with Allian, he and about 3 others managed to get back to Puerto Rico. For 100 years, the Native Americans in Florida kept the European settlers at bay. You hear about Herman de Soto, how de Soto discovered the Mississippi. De Soto was utterly and totally defeated by those Native Americans. I'm telling you this because the tradition of resistance filtered into the blacks who were coming in now into Florida and who were going to write one of the great epic chapters of a struggle in the Columbian era. And you are told in the history books about 2 Seminole wars. The first, the blacks were called Seminoles. Then when the Creek Nation broke up and Sacagawea took his group over the border into Florida, these Creeks were called Seminoles. So there's no cohesive or logical Seminole. It was a word used to describe the people who had come into Florida from the north. And that alliance of the Native Americans and the Africans in Florida held in spite of every effort to break it. You heard about Osceola. Many black people call their children Osceola. Osceola married a black woman, and when he went to have talks with Thompson, General Thompson, at the Fort Gaines, slave catchers captured his wife, and his wife in the Seminole language was called Cochicher, which means morning dew. And this sister was a fighter because the slave catcher who took her, the news came out after that she killed him and committed suicide. But Osceola swore that he would avenge this black woman's capture. And Thompson, the general, he and his men followed him for 2 years. And one night after Thompson had a good dinner and was coming out of his veranda, they filled him with about 14 shots from their rifles. And Osceola, after he fell, shouted, I remember the hour, he said. So we have to remember ours too, you see. No black woman was ever defended in a war in this hemisphere until Osceola fought. He fought, the first Seminole War was fought over that capture of Cochicher. And amongst these groups, you know how we get the research about the Seminole Wars? You have to go to New England, into the libraries, and into the parish records. And there are letters from white soldiers who were fighting in Florida, who wrote home about what was happening. because it was a felony for any journalist to mention that blacks were fighting in Florida. That's why you don't know about it. And that fight went on. And amongst the great leaders who emerged was Abraham. He is one of the great black leaders in this North American history. All of the whites who write about Abraham, even though they hate him, write about him with respect. Abraham was a brilliant man, a brilliant fighter, a brilliant tactician. He knew several languages, and he was one of the chief negotiators. See, while the Spanish owned Florida, Abraham knew that they could stay free. But when the United States bought Florida in 1819, they knew now that the whole might of the United States was going to be turned against them. And that's exactly what happened. By the late 1840s, 2/3 of all the United States armed forces were fighting against black and Seminole insurgents in Florida. 2/3. Over 50,000 troops. It's the greatest war in which the U.S. fought until Vietnam. And Abraham at one point called his followers together and said, "We are fighting for the liberation of all oppressed peoples in this hemisphere. We will never sign a treaty with our enemies." And the whole nation had to vote, and one faction voted that they would sign a treaty. And Abraham and Atlasa, or Tiger Cat he was called in the Coacochi, in the Seminole language, which means tiger cat. He was Abraham's counterpart among the Native Americans. And they left Florida when the whole, after defeating over and over again some of the mightiest of the armies the U.S. had mounted, including now Schlesinger, that historian, writes a biography of Jackson, Andrew Jackson, Stonewall Jackson. Do you know that the blacks in Florida wasted Jackson? He fought at Suwannee. There, that small town, Suwannee is a Seminole word, which means the river of reeds. And there, Atlasa and Abraham met Jackson's forces, and Abraham begged for the right to be the first to attack them. So he held the right wing, and they tore to pieces Jackson's forces. And he was frothing with rage. Here were blacks who he believed were inferior. And some of the tactics they used, they played on Jackson's racism. They sent some blacks in front to look as though they were minstrels. They were chewing and playing banjo and jiving around. And so Jackson let his guard down, so he's coming on now to wipe these blacks off the face of the earth. And right there in those hammocks were waiting the highly trained troops of Abraham. And Jackson now, to take his revenge, you're not going to find that in your history book by Schlesinger, but this is a fact. He went to the settlement where they had left the women and children, and there he fell upon them and slaughtered them. And the history books tell you he won a great victory. And Abraham and his troops and his Seminole comrades had disappeared. And Jackson's advisors told him, if you want to be president of the United States, there's some really bad blacks here in Florida, and they will ruin your reputation to such a point, you never make it to the presidency, so get out of here now. And he left, and he didn't come back. So here, then Abraham and Atlasa took their whole communities to Oklahoma. And there once again they tried to trick them. They kept their arms, they never gave up their arms. And when they saw that once again they're being surrounded and tricked, I'm giving you a very encapsulated history, and I want you to go away feeling better. They fought from Oklahoma all the way into southern Mexico, into northern Mexico, in Coahuila, that border state, where there were about 3,000 black Maroons already to welcome them. They had escaped from the slavery in Texas and those border states. And Atlasa and Abraham lived there with their communities. Now the Texas legislature felt you couldn't have blacks like this, of such renowned fighters, living across the border, while the slave system is still rampant in this country. So these macho Texas Rangers now set out to go and finish off these blacks. The only reports I have of that is the Texas people, which says the 2 expeditions that went returned with their numbers greatly reduced. And Abraham died in bed, there in near a town called Santa Rosa on that Mexican border. And if you go there, I have been there, you can see the descendants of those black Seminoles. You can't hide the features and the blood. It shows. And there you see these larger folk who are ranchers are living there still. And they were given land and freedom by Juarez, the first Native American president of Mexico. He's a full-blooded Indian, Juarez. He gave to these black fighters because he knew they were such renowned fighters, they would prevent incursions from North America. So there was a quid pro quo thing. These are the things that we have to deal with in the Columbian era. Inside of that era, we have fought endless battles. And one of the things that we avoid in the history, and that we should learn from it, when Osceola fights for Cochichir, to make those who would dishonor our women pay for it, as Mao Zedong says, in blood. It's telling us a lesson about equality in the perception of our human beings, of males and females. And we have great weaknesses in this still in our camp.